Today we're going to look at some of the craziest theories ever shared on the Joe Rogan Experience. We will hear Joe Rogan or the guest talk about the theory, and then we will talk about the theory and also, what points people make in favor of the theories. So yeah, this video is going to be pretty out there, so take everything that I say with a grain of salt. These are not all facts or the cold hard truth, they're just theories. All right, well, let's have some fun and start with the Joe Rogan Experience number 2164, where Joe Rogan talks about the theory that angels and demons are actually just aliens. Take a listen.
I've been talking to a lot of people over the last few months, which is maybe not a good sign for the direction my life's going, but I've been talking to a lot of people over the last few months that think that aliens are angels and devils. And that's like when you're hearing about like all those stories in the Bible about fallen angels and devils, like these people think that they were referring to aliens.
That fell from the sky?
No, it's just the term, the way they're phrasing it is like fallen angel, meaning like Satan, and that there's good angels and bad angels, there's demons and angels. What these people believe, and I don't necessarily agree with it, nor do I even understand it enough that I can argue against it, but they believe that all these stories are really referencing a spiritual force that's always here all the time and sometimes exists in the physical form. And it might be existing as these things that we keep looking for, like aliens and UFOs, and it might be doing that maybe even to comfort us, or maybe to be more plausible, or maybe to hide the true nature of what they are. So it will present as if it's from another planet. But really what it is some sort of interdimensional spiritual being that may or may not be evil. It might be good, it might be evil, and there might be a bunch of different kinds out there in the world.
So the first theory that Joe Rogan shares is that angels and demons are actually just aliens. But before we get into the actual theory, let's go back and look at some ancient texts and how they describe angels and demons. So first, the Bible, and more specifically, the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel describes a vision of a being that came down from the sky surrounded by storm clouds and lightning. He talks about 4 living creatures, each one having 4 faces: a human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. He also said each one had wings and legs like those of a calf, but shiny like polished bronze, and they glowed. He then describes wheels within wheels, like spinning, interlocking structures covered in eyes, moving wherever the creatures go. Now to me, that right there sounds mechanical, It doesn't sound human or heavenly. It sounds engineered, like some kind of flying machine. Now jumping over to the book of Enoch, it talks about these beings called the Watchers, or angels, who descended from the heavens and taught humans things like metallurgy and astronomy. It's said that some of these beings even took human women as wives, which led to the birth of these hybrid giants called the Nephilim. Now again, this doesn't sound heavenly or like, it doesn't sound like spiritual guidance. It almost sounds like a technology transfer. Like something came down from the heavens and said, hey, let me show you guys how to melt metal and how to track the stars. And now even weirder, the descriptions of demons throughout, various ancient texts, especially in early Christian and Jewish writings, often include things like terrifying smoke-like forms, voices that come from nowhere, sudden illness, and telepathic communication. To me, this sounds a lot like what people describe during alien abductions or sleep paralysis. Like the feeling of being watched by a presence that's, not there, or hearing a voice inside your mind. Now, all of these descriptions of angels and demons are thousands of years old, but they share these oddly consistent details with modern reports of alien encounters. The glowing, the levitating, the shape-shifting, the speaking telepathically. I mean, just looking at the raw descriptions of how angels and demons were described, it seems as if they were less symbols of good and evil and a whole lot more like beings with technology and power. Like, think about it this way, okay? If you lived in those times and you've never seen a light bulb, you've never heard of an engine, and space travel wasn't even a thought or a thing, then all of a sudden this luminous being descends from the sky in a flash of light. It speaks without moving its mouth, and it's not like anything you've ever seen before. Your first thought is probably that the gods are visiting us, or something along those lines. Like thousands of years ago, human understanding was so limited. There was no frame of reference for advanced species or extraterrestrial intelligence. So everything had to be interpreted through a spiritual or religious lens. If something was powerful and good-natured, it was an angel or a god. If it was terrifying or chaotic, it was a demon or an evil spirit. I mean, we even do this today. If you are having sleep paralysis and you see a shadowy figure, you automatically think it's a demon. If there's something glowing in the sky that doesn't look like a star, oh, it's an angelic sign. And even many divine beings in ancient stories were feared, just as much as they were worshipped. Like the gods of Mesopotamia or the Egyptian deities. I mean, they were merciful, yes, but they were also wrathful and destructive. Kind of like a highly advanced race interacting with a primitive species. Like imagine you could travel back in time and you go to a caveman and give him an iPhone. I mean, he will either worship you or he might take that iPhone and just smash it on the ground. It's the same thing that applies to ancient humans witnessing advanced tech or, advanced beings. They literally had no choice but to assign divine or demonic meaning to it. Like recently, I made a video talking about the Anunnaki and how the Sumerians claimed that these beings, or, gods as they called them, came down from the heavens and taught them how to farm and, do things like that. Today, when we think about these stories, we think that the Anunnaki were basically aliens. Like take, for example, a classic alien abduction story. You have someone laying in bed that suddenly wakes up, but they just can't move. There's a weird buzzing or humming sound, and then all of a sudden, bright lights flood the room, and out appears these beings that are small, gray, and have big black eyes. Most distinctively, they are communicating without using their mouths. The person feels fear but can't scream, and then they float upwards, or they black out. And then suddenly, boom, they're back in their bed. Probably thinking, what the fuck just happened? But that kind of sounds like your classical alien abduction story. Well, what about a classic demonic encounter? I mean, the person wakes up paralyzed, they feel a heavy dark presence in the room, they could see shadows or feel like something's pressing down on their chest, and then they hear voices inside their head, and even sometimes they report missing time or even unexplained marks on their body. So both are very similar. I mean, the only real difference is that one person says they saw gray aliens and the other sees dark spirits or demons. But the core experience is very similar. And let me just say, I'm not exactly just making all of this up. Psychiatrist Dr. John Mack, who taught at Harvard, studied dozens of alien abduction cases, and even he admitted that the psychological patterns behind them resemble traditional religious experiences or spiritual attacks. Basically, this whole theory asks the question, are demons and aliens just two interpretations of the same phenomenon? Are they entities that exist on some kind of spectrum? Like, they aren't strictly physical or spiritual, but maybe something in between. But yeah, I mean, this is pretty much the basics of the angels and demons being aliens theory. Personally, I think they are two completely different things. I think that aliens are a physical entity that are thousands of years more advanced than us. And then demons, I think, are spiritual and not a, physical being, if that makes sense. All right, well, moving on to the Joe Rogan Experience number 1403. Now on this episode, guest Forrest Galante shares a theory that dragons were actually real animals at one point on Earth. Take a listen, because this is pretty interesting.
There's a group of people that say that dragons were real, and I'll explain.
Ooh.
So around the same time period, so to speak, and I'm not one of these people, so I'm probably going to get the details wrong
like
a little
Matthew
bit.
McConaughey movie right now.
Yeah, seriously. But so around the same time period in China, South America, Africa, all these different Rome, all these places, images depicted people fighting dragons, right? And every dragon was slightly different, but it was all a giant scaly animal that could fly. So when you break that down, you think about the fact that large birds had a hard time being fossilized because their bones are so porous, right? So because bones, they have like hollowish bones, they break down very easily and they don't fossilize. So the group that says this, basically they're saying the evidence is the reason there's no fossils of dragons is because they had bird bones and they were actually very delicate animals. But a handful of these small population of these giant flying lizards existed and basically encompassed all these different countries where they all depicted fighting dragons in their own way, and they were all killed off by, knights or whatever it is, and then didn't fossilize.
Okay, the thing about dragons, which is pretty crazy, is that there are dragon stories from all over the world, and in each place, dragons were supposedly very different. I mean, for example, in ancient Chinese culture, dragons were revered, they weren't feared. They weren't these monsters that burnt down civilizations. I mean, they could fly, they could control rain and thunder, and they were considered guardians. Some emperors even claimed to be descendants of dragons. And they weren't like small creatures either. They were long with serpent-like bodies and antlered horns and lion-like manes. And according to ancient Chinese culture, they didn't breathe fire, but they could manipulate the weather, which, I mean, honestly might be cooler than breathing fire. Like, it's said that in ancient China, if the weather was bad, people genuinely thought that the dragons were angry, so they made the weather shit. Now, popping over to medieval Europe, they apparently had the evil fire-breathing type of dragons. They had massive wings, deadly claws, basically the whole shebang. These dragons were often tied to chaos, sin, and even the devil himself. In South America, they had the Quetzalcoatl, which was the feathered serpent god. In Aztec mythology, this serpent god was a creator deity tied to learning, wind, and the morning star. He was depicted as a serpent with feathers and powers over nature. And then even in Mesopotamia, arguably, one of the oldest civilizations, there are records of a creature called Tiamat, which was a massive sea serpent or dragon goddess of chaos. She's one of the first mythological dragons ever recorded. And now what's crazy is that, each region had their own dragons, but it's just crazy how each of them had stories of dragons. Like, yeah, they were different, but it wasn't like, these people were working together to, spread some misinformation, All these creatures had similarities, like being these gigantic, scaly reptilians that fly and either breathe fire or could control the weather. Like, what are the odds that they all had their own version of a dragon? Now, long before paleontology was a thing, people all over the world were stumbling across massive bones buried deep in the ground. They found skulls the size of bathtubs, teeth, longer than your fingers, spines that looked like battle armor, and best of all, they had no idea what these things were. So they just assumed that these bones were bones of dragons. In China, farmers would find giant fossilized bones in the hills, and they called them longu or dragon bones. They even ended up grounding up these bones and used them in medicine. To them, these bones were remains from real dragons that once roamed the earth. Later though, scientists did confirm that these were actually just dinosaur fossils, but hey, maybe they were dragon bones. Maybe the scientists were wrong, who knows? In ancient Europe, woolly rhinoceroses and mastodon fossils and bones were thought to be dragon heads. There's even a case from the 16th century in Klagenfurt, Austria, where workers unearthed a giant skull near a river and assumed it was a dragon that had once terrorized the town. The skull was later identified by scientists as a woolly rhino fossil. So even though, yes, we may not have actual dragon bones or fossils, is it scientifically possible that dragons existed? And to that question, I'd say yes, or maybe, or no. I don't know. Like, take for example the bombardier beetle. This insect literally shoots boiling chemicals out of its abdomen to defend itself. It has an internal chemical reaction that creates a mini explosion. It fires in rapid bursts, and scientists have studied it for years because it's one of the only known examples of biochemical weaponry in nature. So if a tiny beetle can develop a built-in chemical defense system, why not scale that idea up? Like, what if some ancient reptile evolved a similar mechanism? It could have been possible for a reptile to breathe fire, but, that still leaves the question, what about flying? because of course dragons flew. Well, take for example pterosaurs, which were flying reptiles with wingspans over 30 feet. It had hollow bones, huge wings, and an aerodynamic design. I mean, yeah, it didn't breathe fire, but it proves that giant airborne reptiles once existed. And even today, we've got flying snakes and gliding lizards like the Draco lizard. Yeah, it's a small lizard, but it uses flaps of skin between its ribs to glide from tree to tree. Now, that's not a full-on dragon, of course, but it's a glimpse at how evolution already plays with those ideas. Now, if you give nature enough time, say hundreds of millions of years, who's to say it couldn't have created a large fire-spitting winged reptile? Maybe not, identical to our common understanding of dragons, but close enough that ancient humans would have, seen it and said, oh shit, that's a fucking dragon. But of course, there's no fossil evidence yet of a creature that had both flight and fire. But I don't think it's crazy to say that dragons, are possible. I mean, yeah, they are really, really, really unlikely, but hey, sometimes unlikely is all it takes to become a legend. Just like it's unlikely that you guys won't subscribe, but if you do, you'll become a legend. All right, well, now let's move on to the Joe Rogan Experience number 1459, where Tom O'Neill talks to Joe about MKUltra. Take a listen.
MKUltra was a government program run by the Central Intelligence Agency. Originally started as something called Bluebird in 1948-49, morphed into Artichoke, and then in 1952 became MKUltra. It was a mind control program, a brainwashing program. The CIA was trying to learn how to control people's behavior without their knowledge. Now, this all came out in Senate and congressional hearings in the 70s. It was exposed, but nobody knew about it until 1974 when Seymour Hersh, the New York Times reporter, reported it on the front page of the paper. So their main objective was to create what they called hypno-programmed assassins, people who would kill on command, popularly known as Manchurian candidates, after a book that was written in 1962 and later became a movie and then a movie again. The people would be, through drugs and hypnotism, the objective was to get people to go and commit an act of murder against their moral code and have no memory of their programming and be amnesic even of the act after the fact often. That was just that was their main goal, but they were also trying to create couriers, people, military people that they could implant messages, send them, across dangerous areas where there were, at that time it was the Vietnam War, and deliver messages and then have them wiped from their memory in case they were captured.
So back in 1953, right in the thick of the Cold War, America was deep in paranoia mode. The Soviets had just tested their first nuclear bomb, there were spies being caught left and right, and the government was convinced that mind control was the next battlefield. The CIA genuinely believed that if they didn't figure out mind control first, the Russians would turn US citizens into basically brainwashed puppets. So what did they do? They launched Project MKUltra, which was a covert operation run by the CIA's Technical Services Division. And the guy behind it was a man named Sidney Gottlieb. He was a chemist and became the CIA's go-to guy for developing poisons, truth serums, and, well, mind control experiments. And MKUltra wasn't just one experiment, it was actually a web of over 150 sub-projects that included everything from drug testing to psychological torture, brain surgery to electroshock therapy. And now the official goal of MKUltra, at least, this is what they said on paper, was to develop techniques for interrogation and behavior modification. Basically, the CIA wanted to break people's minds and erase their memories. And the craziest part is that they didn't, just test on people who wanted to be tested on. A lot of the test subjects, if you will, of MKUltra were people who didn't even know they were being experimented on. For example, you got prisoners, mental patients, soldiers, and even just regular people who were just walking down the street. And all of this was happening right under the nose of the public. Nobody knew about it. It wasn't like the government was telling people, hey, by the way, we were trying to control y'all's minds. And in fact, most people inside the CIA didn't even know the full scope. It was a very locked down project. Okay, but let's move into what, MKUltra actually did. Their big focus at first was LSD because, to be quite frank, Sidney Gottlieb was kind of obsessed with it. He believed that LSD might be the key to unlocking the human mind. And at first, they tried it on willing participants like CIA agents, military personnel, and even college students who honestly didn't really know what they were getting into. But to the CIA, that started to get boring because, why would you give LSD to a bunch of people who want to take LSD, right? I'm sure there's a lot of people in prison who are saying the same thing. It's a lot more fun to give LSD to people who don't want it or don't expect to be on it, right? So they started slipping LSD to people without their knowledge. They would dose people's coffee or food and then would basically just, sit back, put up their arms, and just observe them. Some of these tests happened in safe houses that the CIA set up in New York and San Francisco. And these safe houses that they tested in honestly weren't even really safe houses. They were literally CIA-run brothels. The operation was called Operation Midnight Climax. And yes, that is actually what they called it. And I'm not just making this shit up. Like, the CIA hired sex workers to lure unsuspecting men to these apartments. And once the men were inside, they were dosed with LSD and observed through two-way mirrors. Agents sat on one side, sipping on martinis and taking notes, and on the other side were men who were just trying to catch a nut but are now just tripping sack on LSD. In prisons and psychiatric hospitals across the country, they tested even more than LSD. They tried electroshock therapy, extreme sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, hypnosis, verbal abuse, and even high doses of barbiturates followed by stimulants. And all of this was to try and break the human mind, to reprogram it. Now, one of the most brutal programs took place in Canada, led by a psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron, who was secretly funded by the CIA. Now, Dr. Cameron would lace maple syrup with LSD and then would give it to some, random Canadians walking down the street. Nah, I'm just kidding. That was a terrible Canadian joke, I'm sorry. But what Dr. Cameron actually did was subject patients to massive doses of electroshock. He kept them in drug-induced comas for weeks, and he even played repeating audio messages thousands of times a day. He believed he could wipe a person's mind clean, literally erase their entire personality and all of their memories, and then basically rebuild their minds from scratch. And he didn't do these experiments on like spies or any of the enemies. He did these experiments on everyday people who went to the hospital for anxiety and depression. There were even tests on military members, sometimes, again, without their knowledge or understanding of what was happening. And if someone started to ask, too many questions, they would be ignored, they would be silenced, or in some cases, they even just flat out vanished. Another crazy part is that the CIA kept almost no consistent records. A lot of these sub-projects were farmed out to universities, hospitals, and private contractors, all under fake names and shell organizations, so no one could trace it back to the CIA. And I just want to reiterate that most of these experiments were done without consent. These weren't people signing up for a study and having to sign a waiver. These were people just being manipulated and drugged, all without even knowing they were being used. One of the most infamous MKUltra cases was Frank Olson. Now, Frank was a biological warfare specialist who worked for the US Army and was involved in some of the CIA's chemical programs. And one day, without his knowledge, the CIA basically spiked his drink with LSD. They didn't warn him, they didn't ask him, they literally just watched him to see what would happen. And stuff started to happen pretty damn fast. Frank started having hallucinations, paranoia, and even had emotional breakdowns. He told his colleagues that he wanted to quit his job and he felt like he was being watched. And just days later, he fell to his death from a 10th story hotel window in New York City. Now, the official story, of course, was that Frank had jumped off the building, but decades later, after MKUltra was exposed, documents revealed that Frank had been dosed as part of an experiment. His family was never told about it, and in fact, they didn't even really know what LSD was until over 20 years after this happened. When they had his body exhumed in the 1990s, a forensic specialist said that the injuries looked a lot more like homicide than suicide. And what happened to Frank is literally, I mean, just the tip of the iceberg. There were dozens, possibly even hundreds of others. Patients in psychiatric hospitals were targeted because they, couldn't fight back. Some were even promised help for depression or anxiety, but then ended up being subjected to forced comas, electric shocks, and drug overdoses. Prisoners were also easy targets. In one case at a federal prison in Kentucky, inmates were given massive doses of LSD for 77 days straight. And I realize now as I'm saying that, it doesn't sound real, but it's true. There was no breaks. It was just one long, ongoing trip for these prisoners. And some of those prisoners were later described as mentally unrecognizable. And then there were the soldiers, many of whom were given drugs and hypnotized as part of stress tests or performance evaluations. Now, the tragic part of all of this is that we will never know how many people were affected by MKUltra. Most of the records were destroyed in 1973, and there's not a list that shows all the victims. And now you're probably thinking to yourself, how is MKUltra a conspiracy theory? Because obviously we just talked about how it was a real thing that the CIA was doing. Well, it's basically because it technically used to be a conspiracy theory. I mean, MKUltra was deliberately hidden from the public, and the project only came to light because of a fluke document discovery in 1977. But years before that, rumors existed, but obviously nobody could prove anything. So that's pretty much why it's considered a conspiracy theory that basically it turned out to be a true conspiracy theory. There were many people who would say back then, oh, the government is trying to control our minds, and it was just seen as a silly theory until it wasn't a theory and people realized, oh shit, the government was actually controlling our minds, or they were trying to control our minds. So yeah, that's MKUltra. Anyways, let's move on to the Joe Rogan Experience number 2327, featuring AJ Gentile from the Y-Files. AJ and Joe, on this episode, talk about crop circles. Take a listen.
Crop circles is a weird one.
So weird.
It's a weird one because when I first saw them, I'm like, what is that? And then I saw that these guys were doing them with boards and string. I was like, oh, it's just people being silly. And then I watched a whole documentary about how the energy that bent these things over caused these nodes to explode as if they'd been cooked in a microwave.
Correct.
I'm like, what? And then you find out that the actual stalks are woven together.
Correct.
It's not that they're pressed down, they're woven together. And that these are complex geometric designs that would have taken people weeks to map out. And there's no footprints leading up to it. There's no roads, no machinery, no evidence of any use of any kind of machinery. And these things appear like that. Like people have flown over an area and then flown back an hour or two later, and there's immense football field size, perfect geometry that no one can explain how it was created.
Correct. So the nodes in the stalks, a node is like a knuckle on your fingers. So those are there for phototropism, to bend toward light. So what you're talking about is these things are bent over. They're bent over at right angles. It can only be done with high energy. But also around these crop circles, they're finding microscopic metallic spheroids in around the circles. And that's not a conspiracy theory. They're finding them. And there are these magnetic fields around the circles. And you can see videos online of people going into these crop circles and their hands start to get red. Things are happening to them. So I went into crop circles thinking it was all guys with boards. But then when you watch people with boards making a crop circle, it's a mess. They can't do this.
A crop circle is an area in a crop field where the plants, usually wheat, barley, corn, or some other tall grass, have been flattened in a specific direction to create a circle. What makes it interesting is that usually the crops aren't broken or destroyed. They are usually bent very low, just above the ground, like they've been, pressed down with heat or energy. Now, of course, most of these patterns in the plants are circular, but over the years, they've gotten, way more complex. Some look like, sacred geometry. Some are perfect spirals, and others stretch, for hundreds of feet. The earliest known reference of crop circles goes way back to 1678. There's this old woodcut illustration from England called the Mowing Devil. It shows a little devil with a scythe moving a circular pattern into a farmer's crops. The story behind it is that a farmer didn't want to pay a worker's price to harvest his oats, so he cursed the field, and supposedly the devil himself came down and cut it into perfect circles. Now, jumping ahead to the 1970s in southern England, people started reporting strange circular patterns appearing in their fields. At first, they were simple, just a single ring or two and a swirl here and there, and these farmers would wake up to these things with literally no explanation. There were no tire tracks, there were no footprints, and there was no animals to blame for this. It was literally like the field had just been visited by something that left no trace of it being there. Then in the 1980s and the 1990s, the design started devolving. Suddenly, it wasn't just circles. There were these complex geometric patterns, formations spanning hundreds of feet, and some even resembling mathematical formulas or sacred symbols. Some patterns were so intricate that experts were baffled at how they could be made at all, let alone, overnight in a dark field. And after all of these encounters, of course, the media started to go crazy. Newspapers, ran the stories. UFO enthusiasts claimed it was extraterrestrial communication. Skeptics blamed pranksters. Scientists got involved, and there were even documentaries and books made about these crop circles. Some of the formations even had eyewitness accounts of people claiming they saw glowing lights in the sky right before a circle appeared, or that, they heard strange buzzing sounds in the middle of the night. It became a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Some of these crop circles even started attracting tourists. People would literally travel all over the world just to walk through the crop circles, or, even just try to feel the energy from space. Not to mention the rise of people who literally called themselves circle chasers. They were basically like storm chasers, but people just chasing crop formations. Now, in 1999, two British guys named Doug Bauer and Dave Shorley basically walked up to the media one day and admitted that they were the people who have been creating these crop circles. They claimed responsibility for over 200 crop circles around England, and, even demonstrated how they did it. They said they'd walk into a field at night, they would press a wooden plank against the crops with their foot, and then they would carefully flatten sections while following a sketched out design. Now, their confession exploded, basically the whole entire mystery, and then suddenly the crop circle tourism went from people trying to uncover the mystery to people who were, there to witness the art. But it gets a little more complicated because, while a lot of crop circles can be explained as human-made, not, all of them can. Some crop circles appear in places with no access roads, some form in the middle of storms in, just a matter of a few minutes, and some show physical anomalies like, changes in the crop structure. There are certain crop circles out there that even scientists, physicists, and plant biologists have struggled to, make sense of. One of the most famous researchers in, the whole crop circles world was Dr. William Levengood, who was a biophysicist who studied hundreds of crop circle samples over the years. He discovered that in some of these formations, the plant stalks weren't just bent, they were changed on a cellular level. Their nodes were elongated and blown out from the inside, almost like they had been hit with a burst of, microwave energy. Also, the soil inside some of these circles showed signs of strange electromagnetic activity. One study showed that magnetic particles in the soil were aligned in a circular motion, kind of like they'd been spun or exposed to a brief intense energy field. And I mean, even get this, some people have reported their electronics malfunctioning when they entered these circles, like their camera batteries draining instantly, phones glitching out, and even cars refusing to start while parked nearby. One of the most talked about formations was the 1996 Julia Set crop circle that appeared in broad daylight. It was a massive spiral made of dozens of small circles forming a complex fractal pattern. A pilot flew over the field at 5:30 p.m. and saw nothing. When he flew back just 45 minutes later, the entire formation had appeared. There were no workers, there was no trucks, it was just a, 900-foot wide mathematical pattern perfectly aligned. So why don't we get into some of the theories? And the first one, which is also the most popular theory, is that crop circles are the work of aliens. People believe that crop circles are a form of communication, almost like a cosmic language written in the fields. These people point to designs that seem to contain mathematical formulas, binary codes, or even responses to messages we've sent into space. Now, there's also the theory that crop circles are made by some kind of natural energy phenomenon. Some scientists have suggested that these could flatten crops into circles with intense pressure and heat, causing the blown out nodes and magnetic soil anomalies people keep finding. Another theory is something called ley lines. These are basically invisible energy lines that supposedly crisscross the Earth. Some believe crop circles appear at intersecting points of these energy lines, acting as some kind of spiritual or energetic message from the Earth itself. Another theory is top secret military tech. Some believe that governments are testing energy weapons, electromagnetic field generators, or even satellite-based tools that can manipulate environments silently and precisely. There's even a theory that crop circles are part of a psychological warfare experiments, and they are testing the public's reaction, basically just to see how easily people believe in wild things. Now, the crazy part about crop circles is that there is no hard truth to what these things are, and that's exactly why they have been talking about and noticing crop circles since literally the 1600s. But anyway, let's move on to the Joe Rogan Experience number 2193, where Jack Symes talks to Joe about the multiverse. Take a listen.
Bring in the multiverse for this too, right? Einstein told us that space is like stretchable, right? So it expands. So we have the moment of the Big Bang, and the universe, or existence as a whole, we might say, space and time, evolves according to the law of inflation. So we keep getting a bigger and bigger area of space. And some physicists think that this inflation happens eternally, that it isn't reasonable to say that it just stopped as soon as our universe was created, or one or two later. So what you have is this popular view in physics where you keep getting more and more of these universes and end up with a popular multiverse view where every single possible physical reality is realized. So there's worlds, according to this view, where we're having this conversation in Spanish, or God forbid, French, right? Or there's a very nearby possible world where we're having this conversation in Italian, German, or Japanese, right?
Exactly the same words, exactly the same pauses, infinitely.
There are worlds, though, and I think the real question we want to ask, there are a bunch of these multiverse views. We spoke at the start about the purpose of philosophy, Mary Midgley clarifying these concepts. This is an idea my friend Ellie Robson convinced me of recently, that it's a really important job in philosophy. We haven't done a good job in physics and philosophy of defining the multiverse. We keep using the word, but you've had Sean Carroll on the show, who's fantastic, and I've spoken to him about his many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
You got views in philosophy that give you every single metaphysical possibility. The easiest one to illustrate it's just this inflation model that I've just given. But what we really want to know is why this matters. Does this change the value of the world?
The multiverse theory is that our universe, the one with, our galaxies and our planets and our, laws of physics and, the dog, sitting right next to you might not be the only universe. Instead, it could just be one universe in a much bigger collection of universes. In this theory, each universe would have completely different rules, histories, or even, different versions of you. Some might be nearly identical to ours, others might be so different that our laws of physics, don't even apply there. Maybe in a different universe, gravity pulls sideways, or maybe time runs backwards. I mean, who really knows? And this isn't just a theory that people like, you and I talk about. I mean, scientists have real reasons for thinking that the multiverse could exist. Some of the biggest ideas in quantum physics and cosmology actually lead to this conclusion, which we will get into those details in a bit, but I just want to make it very clear that the multiverse isn't just one theory. I mean, there are tons of theories that fall into the multiverse category, but I guess to try and group it all together, imagine every time you make a decision, whether that's, what you're going to eat for lunch or what time you're going to go to bed, basically a universe splits. There's a universe where you had pizza for lunch, and then there's another universe where you had a sandwich for lunch. There's a universe where you decided to go to bed at 9, and another universe where you decided to go to bed at 1 in the morning. Now, where did this idea of the multiverse even come from? Well, I mean, this isn't some, brand new theory that we have developed as we've become more, technologically advanced. I mean, this theory has been around for years. Like, even ancient philosophers, like, the Greeks, toyed with the idea of other worlds beyond ours. In the 5th century BCE, a guy named Anaximander suggested that there might be countless other worlds, each with their own beginnings and ends. In the Middle Ages, some philosophers argued about whether God could create more than one universe. But the real scientific conversation started in the 20th century. In 1957, Hugh Everett, a grad student at Princeton, dropped this idea called the many worlds interpretation. Basically, he looked at the way quantum particles behave and how they can exist in multiple states at once. He said, what if all of those possible outcomes actually happen, but just in different universes? So to put this in more simple terms, imagine you flip a coin, okay? And you either get heads or tails. Well, in Everett's theory, both outcomes happen. One version of you gets heads, and another version gets tails, each in a different universe that, split from the moment the coin hit the air. And the theory suggests that this happens every single time a choice is made. Now, when Everett first introduced this idea, the physics community kind of, brushed him off. It sounded, way too out there, but over the years, more and more scientists started saying, wait, maybe this lad is onto something. Then in the 1980s, cosmologists like Alan Guth and Andrea Lind introduced the inflation theory. Now, the inflation theory says that space expanded really fast in the first moments of existence, and that inflation may not have been a one-time thing. It could be happening over and over again, creating bubble-like universes all the time, each one completely sealed off from the others. Then in the 90s and early 2000s, the string theory was brought to light. The string theory suggests that there could be millions or billions or even more possible universes, each with different physical laws, particles, and even dimensions. The deeper scientists dug into the math and the mechanics of our universe, the more it started to look like our universe might not be alone. There's even a multiverse theory called the simulation hypothesis, which says that advanced civilizations might eventually get powerful enough to simulate entire universes with conscious beings inside of them. Which then begs the question, are we in a simulated universe right now? Okay, but is there actually any proof of the multiverse existing? And the short answer and the simple answer is no, not at all. We don't have any direct proof of other universes. You can't point a telescope up at the sky and see Earth number 2, but that also doesn't mean that scientists are just guessing and making things up. There's some indirect evidence, and we're going to talk about it. So going back to the cosmic inflation theory from earlier, basically the one that says space expanded super fast after the Big Bang, well, the math behind inflation actually predicts that new universes should keep popping into existence, like forever. Now, this is what is known as eternal inflation. So according to this model, our universe is just one bubble in an infinite foam of other universes. The theory itself doesn't prove the multiverse, but it accidentally creates, the perfect conditions for one. In other words, scientists, didn't go out looking for the multiverse. The math just kind of brought them there. Then there's quantum mechanics, or the world of particles that can be in multiple places or states at once. In the traditional Copenhagen interpretation, a particle only chooses one state when we observe it, but the many worlds interpretation says, what if it doesn't choose at all? What if every possible outcome happens just in a new universe? There's no way right now to prove which interpretation is correct, but some experiments, like those using quantum computers and interference patterns, seem to behave as if the particles are interacting with multiple realities. Again, it's not solid proof though. The honest truth is just simply, as of now, we can't really prove that the multiverse exists. But some of the most well-respected theories in modern physics accidentally, point to the multiverse. And that's what makes this theory so compelling and, so well talked about. And now going back to Jack's question at the end of the JRE clip, why does it matter and what does it mean? So let's try to quickly answer that. Well, first off, if the multiverse theory is true, then there's not just one version of you. There's wait, that rhymed, didn't that? Sorry, sidetracked. But basically, there are infinite versions of you. I mean, there's a version of you that's a billionaire. There's a version of you that's homeless. I mean, every time you made a choice, big or small, the universe could have split. One version where you said yes and one version where you said no. Like right now, I chose to record this video. In a different universe, there could be a version of me who chose not to record this video. There could be a version of me who's a burger cook. I don't know. But then that also begs the question, if the multiverse is real, what happens to free will? If every possible decision you could make is being played out in some other universe, are you really choosing anything, or are you just a passenger on a version of a train track while all the other versions of you are all on their own paths too? Some people say that if the multiverse is real, then honestly nothing matters. Others say it means everything matters because, every single version of you is real. And getting deeper, if the multiverse is real, does death even exist? There might be a version of you that never dies, or one where you live for 1,000 years because, medicine could have evolved faster. There's even a real concept called quantum immortality. It's basically the idea that from your perspective, you never die. Your consciousness always shifts to a timeline where you survive. It's highly theoretical and honestly pretty freaking controversial, but it shows how far down, this rabbit hole of the multiverse goes. Then there's the bigger, philosophical question. What even is you? Are all these alternate versions really just you, or are they just copies? And if they're not you, then who are you? Are you just this version? Or just in this timeline? Like, yeah, it's some really mind-blowing shit, if I do say so myself. I mean, there are so many different questions you could ask and so many different rabbit holes you could go down, and it's a big mind fuck, I'll tell you that. But hey, that's why so many people talk about it. All right, moving on to the last theory of today's video, which brings us to the Joe Rogan Experience number 1318, where they discuss the theory that the ancient Egyptians visited the Grand Canyon in Arizona. Take a listen.
Lost civilization in Grand Canyon was, Egyptian?
Yeah, the Smithsonian published some stuff in 1909, I guess, that where all this came from. There was an article that got written, and I don't know how much of it they proved or was proven, or it was just newspaper. It was like bait back in the day.
Look at this, even more amazing. The artifacts didn't match up to anything on the known record. Rather than appearing to be of Native American origin, as one might expect, the object had distinct Egyptian or Tibetan designs. Could there have been an entire civilization of Egyptians living here? If so, how did they get here? Dun, dun, dun.
It's not that hard. Hop in the boat, man. You got cats that leave Africa and try to come to Spain on these places on a chicken wing.
Yeah. It is interesting, right? Like the population of Cuba. Cuba's so insanely diverse, and it's right there. Like, what is the history of that other than the slave routes? Like, what is the history of Cuba? Because Cuba has very distinct African people living there.
The whole Caribbean, all that whole area has a lot of African roots to it. But it's just a place that was conquered by the Spain, by the Cortezes, those type of people.
What really disturbs me is there's no way to know exactly what happened. It's like you're piecing things together based on artifacts and historical record, things that people wrote down, and journals and logs. And
on April 5th, 1909, the Arizona Gazette, a real newspaper at the time, published a front page story with the headline, "Explorations in Grand Canyon. Remarkable finds indicate ancient people migrated from the Orient." In the article, a man named G.E. Kincaid, who was allegedly working with the Smithsonian Institution, claims he discovered something absolutely mind-blowing while he was traveling down the Colorado River. He said he stumbled across an enormous cave hidden inside the walls of the Grand Canyon, filled with what he described as Egyptian-style artifacts. According to the article, the cave was packed with hieroglyphic-like carvings on the walls, weapons made of some unknown metal, golden artifacts, a large statue that looked a lot like an Egyptian god, and even what he claimed were mummified bodies placed in stone crypts. The article goes on to say that the Smithsonian was involved, that they were backing the expedition and planning to investigate further. And then it was just, radio silence. There was no follow-up to this article. There was no public records. There was no Smithsonian documentation. It was nothing. It was literally just a story in a newspaper one day, and then the story just completely disappeared. And now here's the thing. G.E. Kincaid has never been verified as a real person. There's no photos, there's no other reports. There is literally no proof that this guy existed outside of that article. And then the Smithsonian, they've gone on record multiple times saying that they have zero knowledge of any such expedition and that no Egyptian artifacts have ever been recovered from the Grand Canyon. But just going with this theory and just, assuming it's real, let's take a deeper look at what alleged artifacts were found. The first thing that was found was the statues. Apparently there were multiple statues that looked Egyptian in design, and one supposedly stood over 6 feet tall and resembled Osiris, which was the god of the afterlife. There were allegedly hieroglyphic style markings carved directly into the cave walls. Kincaid claimed that these symbols resembled those found in Egyptian tombs. There were also apparently metal tools and weapons made from an unknown alloy, which could have been bronze or, something like bronze. There were also golden urns, vases, and ornaments scattered throughout different chambers. And maybe the biggest bombshell was that there was mummified remains placed in stone crypts, positioned just like traditional Egyptian burials. But the issue with all of this is that no one has ever seen these artifacts. Like I said before, there's no sketches, there's no photos, there's no official documents, and there was no follow-up expeditions. Nothing has ever been cataloged, displayed, or stored in any known collection. It's like the entire discovery just, vanished into thin air. So naturally, people started asking, if this discovery was real, then where are the artifacts? If it was a hoax, why would someone go through so much trouble to describe it in such detail? And if it wasn't a hoax, who made it disappear? Which brings us to the Smithsonian conspiracy. Like I mentioned previously, according to the 1909 article, G.E. Kincaid wasn't just out there on a solo adventure. He claimed that he was working under the sponsorship of the Smithsonian Institution. But here's the catch. The Smithsonian says that they have no record of Kincaid, no record of an expedition, and no record of any artifacts being brought back from the Grand Canyon. This has led to one of the biggest conspiracy theories tied to the whole story, that the Smithsonian may have intentionally covered up the discovery to protect the mainstream historical narrative. But why would they do that? Well, some theorists believe that if ancient Egyptians really did reach North America, it would completely flip our understanding of history. It would mean that global travel existed way earlier than we thought, the Egyptian civilization was even more advanced than we give it credit for, and possibly other civilizations made contact with the Americas long before Columbus ever set sail. So the theory goes, the Smithsonian either suppressed the discovery, hid the artifacts, or relocated them, or maybe even destroyed them to basically just keep things tidy. And this isn't the only time that the Smithsonian has been accused of something like this. There are long-standing rumors that the Smithsonian has discarded thousands of Native American bones that didn't fit the evolutionary timeline. They have apparently hidden out-of-place artifacts that challenge accepted archaeology. It's said they've denied access to classified parts of their collection. And now obviously there's no proof of this. But here's the thing. Certain parts of the Grand Canyon, including areas where Kincaid's supposedly explored, are now completely off limits to the public. And that could be a coincidence, or, if this theory is true, then maybe, it's blocked off for a reason. But this theory wouldn't even be something to discuss if the ancient Egyptians weren't even capable of traveling, from Egypt to America. And most people don't realize this, but the Egyptians were pretty advanced when it came to navigation and shipbuilding. I mean, they built large ocean-capable vessels out of cedar wood. They used stars for navigation, and they regularly traveled to far-off places like Punt, which was a mysterious kingdom that, it's still being debated by historians, but it's believed to be somewhere near modern-day Somalia or Yemen. So in theory, if the Egyptians could navigate the Red Sea and possibly parts of the Indian Ocean, the idea that they could have, pushed across the Atlantic honestly doesn't sound that far-fetched. Also, back in the 1990s, a German researcher conducted tests on several ancient Egyptian mummies. And after these tests, she found traces of nicotine and cocaine in the mummified remains. Now that's weird because both of those substances, nicotine from tobacco and cocaine from coca plants, were only native to the Americas. They didn't exist in Egypt or anywhere in the old world at that time. So how did those chemicals, end up inside ancient Egyptian bodies? Well, mainstream scholars have tossed around ideas like contamination or flawed testing, but others see it as potential evidence of transoceanic contact. Some researchers believe this is one of the strongest clues that people from the old world, possibly, even the Egyptians, might have had direct contact with the Americas long before Columbus. So to answer the question, could the Egyptians have reached the Grand Canyon? According to traditional history, probably not. But according to these, odd bits of evidence and research, it's not completely out of the question. So did the Egyptians ever go to the Grand Canyon? Probably not, but there's also a strong possibility they did. Anyway, guys, these have been some of the craziest theories ever shared on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. Now, as always, if you guys enjoyed it, I would really appreciate it if you guys could drop a like on the video, as well as subscribing to the channel with those post notifications on. Anyways, I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. I will see you guys in the next one. Make sure to go check out Jack's Reacts if that sounds like something you're interested in, and peace out.